Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Hey, you're listening to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan. I'm joined with my co-host, Jim Reske, and it's just Jim and I tonight. Just want to give you some, exciting updates of things that have happened with us. I just recently returned from leading a group of people to the Holy Land. So I'm going to talk, Jim's going to interview me a little bit about that. And then, Jim, I wanted to start out with getting an update from you on the book that you're working on.
No, thanks, Greg. First of all, great to be with you. Thanks everyone who's out there listening in. So the book's been quite a journey. Been working on it for a while now, a couple years, and put together a manuscript last year. And I think I may have told our listeners that I got a manuscript together and started working with an editor who has published 5 Christian books himself, and who really worked with me and went through things, the draft with a fine-tooth comb, and not just like editing to make suggestions, but really reorganizing everything, reorganizing the thought flow, understanding who the target audience is, the kind of discipline you have when you're really writing a book, not just writing out a stream of consciousness. Because when I started it out, Greg, I'm so excited about the content, which is the gospel, which is what makes you and I gospel addicts, that I just had so much to write, and it's just getting it out was important. And then giving it to somebody who say, yeah, that's great, but let's really organize it like a book and put it together.
Well, and because we might have people just listening for the very first time, can you talk about just the topic of the book?
Yeah, the basic topic of the book is the gospel gap. It's an illustration you and I talk about all the time, and it's a contrast of 2 different ways to live your Christian life. And you might think of it as outside-in transformation versus inside-out transformation. But the basic notion is that if you want to draw a picture of the Christian life, you could do it by just drawing a simple graph of holiness on the y-axis, with a vertical axis, and then time on the horizontal axis. And if you want to say, well, what does a Christian life look like? You would draw a diagonal line that starts at the bottom left and moves up to the top right. And if you stop there, of course, that looks like every other religion, because every religion is based on a set of rules you have to follow, which means over time you become a better and better Jew, or better and better Hindu, better Muslim or Buddhist, anything as a set of tenets, rules, principles, and that they will call holiness or righteousness or goodness or anything. And over time, you moved from the bottom left to the upper right. You become better and better in that religion. And this view applied to Christianity is that the gospel starts you off. It's a little cross in the bottom left corner of that illustration. Starts you off, gives you a clean slate, and then the rest is up to you. And spiritually, that would mean your justification is by faith and by grace, but your sanctification, your Christian walk, how you grow in Christ, your Christian life, your Christian experience is all driven by you and your hard work and effort. And I think, Greg, we talk about the ABCs. How do you put that when we talk about that?
Well, for some people, the gospel is the ABCs of the Christian life, and then you move on to deeper, doctrine. But really, what you and I believe with all our hearts is that the gospel is not the ABCs, it's the A to Z of the Christian life. It is the Christian life. You never move beyond it. It's just as important for Christians as for non-Christians. And that changed my life, because as a young Christian, I kind of fell into the trap of what you just shared, of thinking that, Christ got me, my salvation was through the gospel, through what Christ did for me on the cross, paying for my sins. But when it comes to being a better Christian, it was all up to me and my hard work and effort. But that leads you to a lot of pride if you're successful.
If it's successful.
Yeah, if you're successful, or sort of despair if you're not successful. And I can remember kind of feeling both those as a struggling Christian. And I realized I kind of moved beyond the gospel,
Yeah.
and I needed to kind of return to the gospel. And that really, through God's grace and teachings I was exposed to from, both of us really appreciate the ministry of Dr. Timothy Keller.
That's right.
That really kind of brought me back to, wait a minute, grace is what saves me. The gospel is what saves me, but it's also the key to our spiritual growth and development. So
That's
you
right.
described the one way. So quickly describe the new illustration.
Yeah, and I think since you're kind of very similar to your personal experience, Greg, and this is before you and I met. I mean, my personal experience to my early 30s was just like yours, and really getting burned down on it, feeling, and I write about this in the book, but just feeling like this is just so hard. It's so hard when you think about your Christianity on a scale of 1 to 10, and you feel like you could never get above a 5 or maybe a 6 on a good day. Maybe I reach to a 7, then I'm back to a 3 or 2. And you talk about, if you do get up that ladder, you feel a little bit of pride. And in fact, if you're a spiritual leader and you have that view of the Christian life, you would say, well, absolutely, I want to use pride and fear as motivational tools, because the whole point is to move you up and to the right. And so, but you really burn out on it. And we got to the point where we were almost ready to walk away from the whole thing, feeling like it's just too hard. And that's when we lived in New York City. We attended Tim Keller's church and really started to hear the gospel in a totally different way. And it's really depicted in this thing I want to write about, which is this illustration to show how the gospel is operative for your whole Christian life. It's the A to Z. You never, like you said a minute ago, you never leave the gospel. That's why we're gospel addicts. That's why I feel like, I felt like when it happened, when I really started to get a glimpse of that gospel, I was born again already, but then I was born again, and felt like I just can't stop talking about Jesus. That's why that's really actually why we love doing this podcast together, just because I love talking about Jesus.
And that's why the whole podcast is called Gospel Addicts, because we're addicted to the gospel, to the good news of Jesus, because we think it's the best news ever.
Best news ever. And I think people, we're always stunned, right? When people don't take the offer. Why would you not take this offer? And I think part of it is because people look at Christianity like that single line. They say, wait, you're offering me the chance to move up to apply myself with a lifetime of toil and hard work and effort to maybe please a God who's never satisfied. No thanks. Or they're already living the Christian life. They're saying, I've kind of had it. Like I'm always feeling bad and guilty. I never measure up. No thanks. And when you get a glimpse of the real gospel, you say, taste and see that the Lord is good. Why wouldn't you take it? So, anyway, the contrast is looking at that. I'm sorry, what, you're going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, isn't a big part of the book that you're writing contrasting religion from the gospel from religion, the difference between religion versus the gospel?
Yeah, and I think that I spent a lot of time actually on the illustration we just talked about, because that is a religious way of thinking of your Christian life. That, I obey, therefore I'm accepted, and I climb the ladder. Maybe at the end of my Christian life, I'll bet you a lot of our listeners will resonate with this. If you, at the end of your life, maybe you'll hear, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Aren't those words you want to hear? Won't your heart swell up with pride? Is everyone else behind you in line, their spirits are crushed because they're not going to hear, but you've done better. You're a 9 out of 10. Welcome in. We rarely get people like you around here. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Isn't that great? That's supposed to be motivational, but it's crushing, right? And that whole way of thinking about even that verse is driven because you're reading the Bible through that single line paradigm, which isn't right. It isn't the gospel. So, but anyway, we try to kind of treat all that in the book and then kind of shift to what, sometimes call a double line paradigm, or basically the gospel gap for short, which I think is a shorthand way of thinking about it.
So going back to that verse, the "well done, thou good and faithful servant," what do you think the gospel, looking at that through the lens of the gospel, what does that look like?
Well, because we talked about this before, Greg, but the servant in that verse isn't you. We read the Bible, read ourselves into it, and you say, it's all about me. It's all about what I've got to do. And when God is going to look at me at the judgment, He is going to look at me through the lens of everything Jesus has done and all my evil, rotten to the core, sinful self has been put on him and wiped away, and all his glorious righteousness has been put on me in the great exchange, right? That's the verse Isaiah 1. Though your sins are as scarlet, they'll be white as snow. That's the great exchange. And in that, he's going to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant, but it's capital S servant because it's Jesus's record and not mine.
That's also 2 Corinthians 5:21.
Exactly.
God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
Yeah.
I don't know if I quoted that exactly right, but I think I got the gist of it.
You did.
There's just so many verses when you really understand the shift. It's a massive shift.
Massive shift.
In thinking of your sanctification. This isn't your salvation. This is your sanctification.
That's right.
It's a massive shift. And when you start reading the Bible through this lens, the Bible just comes alive. I mean, there's verses like in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, which says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us as believers who are being saved, it's the power of God.
That's right.
I mean, right. And then Peter writes, grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus. Grow in grace. That's right. That's exactly what you're talking about. What does it mean to grow in grace? It's inside out. It's not outside in. So often religion is outside in. It's like, we do all this stuff. But the gospel is D-O-N-E. It's done. It's been done for us through Christ, through the cross. So as you've been working on your book, and I know you've been working on it for quite some time, you're reorganizing. Is there anything you want to share, like related to like some cool ways that you've reorganized it or
yeah. Well, so actually right now you just mentioned this, the word shift. I'm just polishing off a couple chapters towards the middle of the book that really talk about this gospel shift, this paradigm shift, and the notion that it is a paradigm shift. You see the world through that lens, the single line lens, like every religion. And if you read the Bible through that lens, a lot of things just don't make sense. A lot of things don't make sense. You say these Old Testament characters are supposed to be examples for us. They're supposed to be 9s and 8s and 9s on the 1 to 10 scale. They're awful. They do all kinds of miserably bad things. I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense. And it's because you're using the wrong paradigm, because you're using that single line paradigm to read it. And then the Bible is filled with stories of people who make the shift from the single line to the double line. So from a religious paradigm to a gospel paradigm, and contrast, sometimes in the same chapter, with people who don't make the shift or refuse to make the shift or can't make the shift. Right. And anyway, I go into great detail about that. But this contrast of and that's why Jesus says so many times, he uses metaphors of opening your eyes and healing a blind person that they may see. And these people are blind in their sins, but they want to open their eyes. The opening your eyes in the gospel, and there are our listeners who are Christians will get this right away, right? Suddenly, when you get the gospel, everything looks different. It's a paradigm shift. The lens through which you look at the world shifts completely, and you see everything differently, including all those old passages you read before that seem to be motivational stories for you to be just like them and work hard to climb up the ladder and turn your 6 into a 7 and keep going. And now you say, oh, these people were recipients of free grace just like me. They're lost to their sins just like me, and God gave them to his righteousness. So anyway, that's what I've been working on recently, and it's coming together. My hope is this year we can really get it out there and get in front of some publishers, and we'll see what happens.
Have you been adding new content?
Some of the content I have, some of it's reorganization of stuff I've already written. The new content is trying to put it to understand in terms of Christian leaders and how they can use it, and then also in evangelism, how it can be used in evangelism. Because a lot of the evangelical tools we use in the past are really kind of simple and fall short, really, and I don't think they always work with a modern audience. So trying to relate it and have it touch down where it can be used as a tool for evangelism. That's some of the new content.
Okay, how close do you feel like you are to finishing the project?
I got a day job,
right?
So keep my job, and pretty demanding job as it is, and It's not like it takes that much time. It's the long gaps in between picking it up and working on it. So, and I think the last 2 weeks I've been on a tear, and it's amazing when God puts this kind of thing in your heart. It's like you have to get it out, And I started off thinking I'm just going to put all this into a Microsoft Word document that my kids could read someday, and it feels so. It's like it's just such a burden just to get it out and get it out somewhere. And maybe it'll just be self-published on Amazon. That'll be enough. Just want to, we'll see, but we'll see. Hopefully someone could benefit from it.
Well, I think, you and I agree. It's it's such an important thing. And so many Christians have the default setting of the human heart is towards hard work and performance.
That's right. Religiosity.
And that default setting is so, once we become a follower of Jesus, it doesn't mean that default setting goes away.
No.
It can still get tripped. We can still fall back into it.
Yeah. Just examples. My wife and I were just talking about this, going through Bible study materials that are supposedly, Christian evangelical Bible study materials that still default to that single line way of thinking. Now that you're saved, here's a list of 6 tips and tricks you've got to do. Here's 10 steps, easy steps to fill the gap between you and God. You've got a lot of work to do, and these are things you have to do, instead of seeing all those things through a gospel lens, right? And pulling you back to Jesus, but it's falling right back in that religiosity. And then the other thing I think, and this is part of the evangelism thing, is even as you're describing the gospel to people, they use that lens to hear everything you're saying. They hear everything you're saying through that lens. If you say, I am not trying to achieve anything on my own, I'm a wretched sinner, wretched, poor, and blind. God gave me his righteousness. I have no righteousness on my own whatsoever. You're describing the gospel in words. The listener, the non-Christian listener, especially today, hears you through the single line lens.
They do.
They're applying that to you, even if you're not describing a single line, you're describing something totally radically different. They'll say things like, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. You got it all figured out, don't you? You think you're so good and you're at the top of some line. You're trying to get me to, I hear it. You're trying to get me to adopt your religion. And you say, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. It's the gospel. It's radically different than all that. Yeah. I know. They've tuned you out already because they are hearing you through that. So I think that's, and look, this is the thing in a nutshell. Let's go to this part 2 of the podcast. Because I want to hear about your trip. But the thing is, the reason I'm fired up about the book, this little illustration and the way, it's laid out, the way I've laid it out, the contrast between the single line and the double line makes the whole thing really crystal clear in about 5 minutes. You can describe it as something in 5, maybe 2 minutes. It's and you could listen like I did to years and years of great preaching like Tim Keller, and it's all in there, and you could get it. You can just read the Bible and get it. But the illustration does? In a minute, you say, that's it. It just clicks like, that's it. That's the contrast. It lays it out. And then because you have the paradigm in front of you graphically, you can then hear those things and say, now it makes sense. And that's I think, unique contribution of the book. So stay tuned.
Well, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So,
amen.
I love, in my ministry, I love sharing little illustrations, simple illustrations that illustrate profound truth. The bridge to life, and this is one of those illustrations. I shared a form of it with you.
You did,
because I was listening to Tim Keller, and I was like, there's something different about this. There's something. And a couple of his talks just kind of came together to me, and I started using this and sharing this with people, and it's exciting. It's a very, very important thing, and
full attribution. When you read, I think you saw an early draft, but when readers get maybe someone gets a real book, full attribution, there'll be, and it's either in the foreword or in the first chapter. I'll say, like, my good friend Greg Bryan showed me the basic bones of this illustration, because I listened to Keller for years already at that point, saw the basic from you, illustration of the 2 lines from you, and then kind of built it out from there. And I think then what I'm trying to draw out and can add to that. And by the way, and also full attribution, we've seen it published in a real basic form in a couple other books. And I put all that in the book, just to give credit where credit's due. But the unique contribution is contrasting it with a single line, and then also understanding, well, where does my Christian growth fit in? How my life does change as a Christian. How does that, I am supposed to become a stronger person. I am supposed to be sinning less, right? What does that mean? And how do I, not fall into license and just say, well, fine, I'll do whatever I want, or legalism, right? And say, well, I got to follow a bunch of rules to follow. And in laying it out the way it's laid out helps make that clear instantly, and then draw those contrasts to say, oh, that's how all those elements of the Christian life fit in together.
Yeah, well, one of the implications you brought up just a few minutes ago that I just think is huge, and then we'll wrap this up. This part of it is the fact that when we share the gospel with people, they just, most people, they either put you in the camp of you're religious or you're irreligious, and I think a lot of us. The reason we're not effective in evangelism is we're not good at explaining that we're not religious. We're
That's
not,
right.
and if we could really understand the way people are listening to us and hearing some of the things we're saying, that they're hearing them through that, putting us in those two categories. If we could develop tools that will help people see that, no, we're not religious and we're not irreligious. We believe something totally different that's life-changing. I think that is huge. And I think this illustration that you have does that. It helps people understand that. So I'm excited for you, praying that, you're able to finish this up and find a publisher and get this out there. And in the meantime, we'll just continue to give bits and pieces through the podcast here.
Yeah, little drips and drabs, and help people kind of put it all together. So hopefully out very soon. So we'll see.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.